It's one of those hot button issues that gets people on both sides of the issue upset. And then there's always some group of people in the middle that they just feel uncomfortable whenever people get really hot under the collar over a certain topic. What should people wear to church? And yes, I'm very aware of the irony of preaching on this with our kids in Awana tonight in their pajamas, so that is not lost on me. One of the reasons that it is so hotly debated amongst Christians is because the Bible really doesn't say a whole lot about it. It talks a lot about appropriateness and different things like that, but not brass tacks particulars that we are so wanting many times in our own arguments. Whenever I'm asked what a person should wear from someone who I've invited to our church, I pretty much always answer somewhere along the lines of saying, I promise you, whatever you wear, someone else is going to be dressed just like you in some way, shape, or form. You understand while I do that, I want to break down as many barriers as I possibly can to get that person under the sound of the gospel and among Christians who love them. What they wear is absolutely and totally, not even secondary, it is last in my book when it comes to that kind of thing. I want to get them under the sound of the gospel first. We really do have a pretty broad spectrum of dress among our congregants, and I think that is, for the most part, healthy. I really do think that most of these kinds of discussions ought to be handled in small groups rather than a large one. But I want to give you two A's tonight that Rachel and I have found helpful in discussing this kind of thing with friends, with teenagers when I was student pastor, and even now our own girls. The first one, the first A, deals with the actual piece of clothing, and the second A deals with the heart beneath the clothing. So that first A is A, appropriate, appropriateness. What we wear ought to be appropriate for the occasion, not just at church, but for any occasion. What I wear to church and what I hike in are very, very different. Not because one is holy, although one is H-O-L-E-Y, holy, and the other is sinful, but because each is appropriate for that occasion. Function, comfort, design, and yes, modesty all play a role in appropriateness. So that's the first A. Is it, or is what I'm wearing appropriate? The second is attention. The question is this: who are you dressing for? Is it prideful, attention-grabbing that you are? Is that the reason why you are wearing what you wear? If so, that's dangerous ground. It reveals more about your heart than it does any other part of your body. Are you attention-seeking by what you are wearing? Is what you are wearing appropriate? We have some in our church who prefer a more casual wardrobe, and I have absolutely no issue with that. In many ways, I think that reflects some of the New Testament early churchgoers who didn't see church as a service or as an event, but as a way of life. You've got the Bereans of Acts chapter 17, who they met daily for worship. I think you and I both would be kidding ourselves if we thought that their schedules allowed them to go home and put on their church clothes before they met for a worship service together. So I always warn, though, in that line, be careful that your worship does not become haphazard. That's the danger of a casual sense, is that it just becomes secondary, haphazard. That if your clothing isn't thought out, then nothing else has been thought out. And I know that's not a total sum game, but oftentimes that is how it goes. We approach the throne of grace haphazardly, and that's dangerous. We have some in our church who prefer a more dressy wardrobe. By the way, I understand that dressy and casual are very pejorative terms, that it means something totally different to me than it probably does to you, but we have some in our congregation who prefer a more dressy wardrobe, and I think that I have absolutely no issue with that either. In many ways, I think that it reflects some of the Old Testament worshipers who made the temple, made synagogue worship the event of their week. They didn't, pass by it all throughout the rest of the week, but it was the thing that they sought for every single week. They were walking near the presence of God and they didn't want it to be seen as though they were looking on that lightly. And so they washed up. You see some of the stringent washings that they do. I'm not saying that people who dress casually are unwashed, but they took particular time and a lot of forethought into what they wore and how they wore it. I always warn this group, though, and Peter and Paul, both under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, beg believers the exact same thing. Don't get too dressed up. That really is one of the most practical pieces in Scripture as it deals with dressing for worship. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, Peter, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, says, "Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God." Paul, in a similar way, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 says, "In the like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness, with good works." The whole idea is that it's not to be an attention-seeking thing. Whatever you wear, be it grungy, casual, or super dressy, it ought not be something that is you are trying to get the attention of everybody on you. I think we've probably all erred in one direction or both at times. I know I have, dressed inappropriately, I've worn things that I wanted to get a compliment from somebody on. And I think that this is an important discussion. But it should always be a discussion where grace and Christian love abounds. Always. And that's, again, why I think it ought to be done in a more personal setting than in a broad spectrum like this. There's just too many factors to take into account to have a definitive dress code for church. Styles change so much. If the Christians of the 17th century saw a modern-day believer wearing a suit attending church today, they would tell him he probably needs to go home and dress up a little bit because he can still breathe with that collar, and he needs to dress up more. So styles change. Culture is so different. The Middle Eastern Roman robes of the first century would be seen as totally unacceptable in most modern American churches. I know I would look twice if a man came walking in wearing a robe this morning. Also, what is appropriate in modern-day Kenya right now really might not be the best thing to wear in Cheatham County, and vice versa, by the way. So just think of that. That takes us into contextualization. Contextualization, it needs to be a part of the discussion too. The late great missionary Hudson Taylor was all but shunned and disassociated when it was found out from his British sending missions agency that he wore Chinese garb and a hairstyle in the Chinese fashion instead of English. God does not save people so they can look Western. God doesn't save people so they can look American, so they can look like you. He saves them so he can conform them into the image of his Son, not our beloved culture. So we need to keep that in mind. There's many others. Finances, it needs to be taken into account. There's a ton of other factors that ought to be gone over in this discussion about what we ought to wear to church. I know horror stories, absolute, total horror stories of those that require a dress code in order for somebody to come into their sanctuary. And I find that form of legalism utterly unbiblical, lacking in grace, and totally unchristlike. That's actually what sparked me into giving this kind of introduction. The way in which we have this discussion actually speaks to the main point of 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 7. It's not really about a dress code for church at all, except that it says that we all, each of us, ought to be clothed with humility. He doesn't talk about the actual garments of physical that people actually wear. What the Spirit is more concerned with is that we are clothing ourselves in humility. Humility isn't affected by finances like dress is. Anyone can be humble. Style has no bearing on humility because it is, in whatever culture and whatever time period, always unfashionable to be humble. It's a suit that best fits other people. We think they ought to be humble, but we have an excuse for our pride. After all, we earned it. It just doesn't sit well with us. But it just never really fits us exactly right. Peter first targets those of us in the church who are younger. Now, we're going to use terms, again, that are pretty broad, and I will let you people self-identify as anything and everything today. So I'll let you self-identify as to whether or not you think you're younger or whether or not you think you're elder. I am not going to be the judge of that. I've got too many people upset with me already today. So you decide whether you want to link yourself with the younger in 1 Peter chapter 5:5 or with the older in 1 Peter 5:5. And by the way, it's not going to work out like you think anyway. Verse 5, likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Well, I'm an elder, absolutely. Now, he goes on, yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Let's talk about that first part there. You younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Some of the more literal, word-for-word Bible translations even read, you younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders. Peter starts with those who by natural inclination are more prone to pride. They are more prone to charge forward, to trample beneath them anyone who stands in their way. They are pig-headed, gonna do their way or the highway, young men in the church. It's not in their nature to submit. It's not in any of our nature, but specifically youth and male, they're just going to do their way. And submission is often seen as a weakness. Young men are so interested in proving themselves to others that they oftentimes stop and ask questions. They don't stop and ask questions because in their mind, it shows cracks of uncertainty in our culture. And that can be more further from the truth, but that's how we perceive it. We think that if you don't know something, that's a weakness. The greatest thing you could do is ask questions. I read recently that children are estimated to ask 125 questions a day. Some of you parents are like, no, that's 125 questions in an hour, right? But by the time we're adults, do you know how many questions we ask on a daily average? 6. Now look, I understand. We've learned a lot more about life over the years, so it doesn't necessitate that we ask the number of questions that we used to. Also, hopefully we've settled down a little bit from what you don't have to ask, what are we eating for dinner 500 times, right? So that deals with some of it. But have we really learned that much that it goes from 125 all the way down to 6? Lost 119 questions that we've asked in a day. I suggest that it's not that we've learned so much, but we're just too proud to ask the questions. We don't like being humble. We don't like submitting ourselves to somebody else and asking them, how do you do something, or what's your take on something? And so we just simply are quiet. And Peter calls us out for it too. Young people, young men, submit to your elders. Submit. It's a military term in the Greek text that means to line up under. Or maybe in our modern day thinking of military terms, fall in line. March behind with your elders. It's probably a better reading of the text. Allow them to lead you. Peter knew that far more contentious than any discussion on dress or worship style were the issues between those who have been there and done that and those who are eager to prove that they can go there and do that too. And so that's why he urges the youth, again, however you would put yourself there, the young men, to make sure that they're submitting to the older in the church. We live in a church culture that elevates youth and vitality and everything new and everything on trend. Well, the Spirit moves on Peter to remind us that God has given us the blessing of a community among elders who have a lot to offer. Listen to them. When they don't give you the piece of information because they're wise and they don't want to just hit you over the head with it, ask them. I'm preaching to myself more than anybody tonight. Just when you think Peter is just he's gotten old and crotchety in his ways and he wants to teach these young whippersnappers a thing or two, he throws in the rest of the verse because it's not really about youth versus elder. It's more about us serving each other. He goes on in verse 5 and he says, "Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." It's not a tirade against youth. This is a universal urging for all of us to fall in line with each other and be humble. I'm going to say something. This sentence, it might hurt. It really doesn't matter because the truth hurts sometimes. If you have a problem with submission, it's not that you have a problem with your elders, your husband, or your parents. You have a problem with God. If submitting hurts you, it's not an issue with either of those three. Elders, parents, husband. You have a problem with God. All the Christian life is built upon humble submission. If you miss that, you have missed Christianity. Jesus proved that when in the upper room, hours before his arrest in Gethsemane, he quite literally clothed himself in humility, taking off his outer garment, wrapping himself in a towel, and washing his disciples' feet. I happen to think that this is the very instance that Peter is recalling while he's writing this text. When he urges us, when he begs us to clothe ourselves with humility, I tend to think he's thinking about this very time. And those of you who remember that story there in John, remember that Peter refused to submit to Jesus' example of serving him. Jesus comes to him after washing a couple others' feet, and Peter says, absolutely not. No way are you going to wash my feet, Jesus. And so Jesus warned him that if he did not wash him, he would have no part with him. If you do not submit to me and what I am doing to you, you have no part with me, Peter. And so for Peter, discussion over. He wanted Jesus more than his own pride, more than his own pride of having another person wash his feet, which, by the way, is very humbling to have someone else wash your feet. Last feet washing service, it was the honor to wash Brother Tom's feet. I don't know how in the 9 years we've been together that I've never had that opportunity. We always wait to see if there's any stragglers that we can grab them and stuff like that, but we were the stragglers this last time. And so we washed each other's feet. And let me tell you, it's very easy to wash a man's feet whom you respect. It's very difficult to have him bend in front of you and have him wash your feet. And that's what Peter's going through. But even that, it's a submission to what Christ is calling him to do. He begs Jesus, after finally submitting, he says, don't just wash my feet. Wash my hands. Wash my head. Essentially, drench me in whatever. I'll do whatever. I'll get rebaptized. I'll go through the whole thing. I'll jump in a freezing cold river. I don't care. I want to be a part of you, Jesus. And Jesus kind of chuckles and tells him, if you've already been washed, you don't need to be washed again completely. Submitting is so much easier said than done. It's so easy to preach about submission. Man, it's so easy to preach about it. So easy to talk about it, so easy to do a Bible study on it, but it's totally difficult to actually do it. It means holding your tongue at times. It means some or a lot of discomfort. It means thinking of yourself less. It means seeking out ways to promote those above you instead of getting a leg up yourself. It's not an easy task. And that's why God gave us the promise that He did here in this passage of Scripture. What do we get when we humbly submit? Peter writes 3 things. He writes that we get acceptance by God, that we get the grace of God, and ultimately we will be exalted by God. I don't really understand any of those, but let me just for a few minutes, let's talk about those 3 things that we get when we submit to God. He says in the latter part of verse 5, quoting from a proverb, he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. God resists the proud. So the opposite is true in this case. That means He accepts the humble. But He doesn't just accept us like, I guess you can come on in, heaven, you kind of made it by the skin of your teeth kind of thing. That's not the acceptance He talks about here. He lavishly gives grace upon grace to the humble. He heads up, or He heaps up that which we do not deserve in order to persevere through that which we could not go through on our own. He gives us grace and grace and grace and grace so that in our perseverance, in our submitting, which hurts to other people, we get grace for doing so. And enough grace to go further, a little bit more, until finally God exalts us, that He may exalt you in due time. God lifts us out of our momentary sufferings incurred by living a submissive lifestyle in this dog-eat-dog world, and He exalts us. We don't deserve it. He lifts us up and out and in to Him. That's what exalting means. I'll never forget the first time that I really listened to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. Dr. Bruce Barnes, one of my professors in college, was preaching chapel from that text. And he has this booming bass voice. And in his preaching, he punctuated every line in 1 Corinthians 4, 5, but especially the final one. It reads, "Therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts." This part he punctuated. "Then each one's praise will come from God." In that verse, 1 Corinthians 4, 5, we are warned of a judgment of all of our motives for all that we have ever done, and whether or not we did them out of pride or out of actual service and submission to God. There will be a time when you stand before God and all of those Sunday school lessons that you taught to those snotty-nosed kids, that He will take them, He will bring them in front, and He'll say, okay, now let's see what you did out of your own selfish pride so that somebody would come by and give you a pat on the back, and which part of that you actually did for true service with God. And He will, as it were, melt it away, kind of like dross. All of those things that were done for selfish ambition, that were done for pride, that were done for a kind of attention seeking, all those things, well, they'll just melt away until the only pure motive that's left. And you would think, we're going to lose a lot in that day. I'm just going to be honest with you. The best of us will have lost a lot. And all that will be left there is this small, minuscule little bit of true, sincere service to Christ. And you would think that the God of the universe, that the judger of our souls, the judge of our souls, would step back and say, what in the world? I gave you so many blessings, and this is how you repay me? That's not what this passage says. He says in the end there, then each one's praise will come from God. When it's all boiled down, when only the true, pure motives are left, do you know what will happen? God will step back and the King of the universe will applaud us. Each one's praise will come from God. For this little pathetic little bit that we did for him, he will say, well done. That is what is meant here when he says that he will exalt us in due time. It's not just a picking us up out of suffering, it's a seating us beside him. Joint heirs with Christ, we talked about in Sunday school this morning. Exalted by God. Someone once wrote, he exalts us in due time for living a life of exalting him. And almost in this whole message, this short paragraph, just kind of tagged in on the back end of this paragraph, when it's talking about humble submission to Christ, elders and each other, Peter writes a powerful verse that many of us have clung to throughout some of the darkest moments of our lives. He says in verse 7, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Are you worried that submitting to this God is going to take you down a path of absolute and total helplessness, of hurt and pain? He cares for you. When you submit to him, you are not submitting to a tyrant, although he would be justified in being one. You are falling in line with a benevolent king who cares deeply for every big and little anxiety which bogs you down. He says, submit to me because I care for you. It's easy to fall in line with someone when you know that they have your best interest in mind. And sometimes with all of our fleshly anxieties and all of our doubts and all of our fears, we might begin to think, God, this doesn't make sense. This path that I feel like you're leading me down to, it does not make human sense. And there are times when it absolutely does not. It's going to require sometimes you leaving family. It's going to require you sometimes giving up positions. It's going to require a lot from you. But knowing that at the end of it all, he deeply cares for you. It ought to make us fall right in line, submit to him, and as our elders and as each other fall in line, then we submit to each other, that we live a life of humbly serving each other and humbly serving God. So, a bit of a bait and switch, a lot of a bait and switch. What is New Hope Church's dress code? Well, let's try on humility. We'll even let you walk out the store with it. And we'll let it affect every single part of our life. It's not something you just put on when you come to church. It's something that we wear daily. Let us wear humility